Colonial Cambodia's Bad Frenchmen. The Rise of French Rule in the Life of Thomas Caraman, 1840 to 1887, by Gregor Muller. So, I've mentioned this on this channel a few times before, but a few years back, when I went to live in Cambodia, I wanted to make a reading project out of the French colonial era in Cambodia and Southeastern Asia generally, which is something I'd always been meaning to read up on but never had, and now that I was going to live there, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. So I got together 3 books, The Roots of French Imperialism in Eastern Asia by John F. Cady, which I've reviewed on this channel already, and The French Presence in Cochin China and Cambodia by Milton Osborne, which I've also reviewed on this channel. And then this is the 3rd one. I saved this one for last for a couple of reasons. One is because just chronologically, this seemed to be the last one in the chronology. Kind of. Actually, Milton Osborne's book encompasses the period both before and after this. But also this one looked to be the most interesting. I mentioned, again, when I've been talking about these books, I mentioned that what I was really looking for was a popular history, an armchair history. The kind of book that would be sold at Barnes and Nobles or like a popular bookstore. And it appeared that there didn't seem to be that many books in English on the French colonial period in Southeastern Asia, at least before the Vietnam War. So of these 3 books I was able to get together, this one looked to me like it was going to be the most interesting, like this was actually going to be a popular history. And I was slightly disappointed when it turned out that it wasn't really what I was expecting. It was more of an analytical history than a popular history. But I'll get to that in a moment. First, I should probably talk about what this book is about. The title of this book is Colonial Cambodia's Bad Frenchmen. But actually, in the title, Bad Frenchmen is in quotation marks, which indicates that these are not the words of the author himself. Rather, the words Bad Frenchmen come directly from the phrase used by the French Colonial Office itself. Of course, they said it in French, des mauvais français. Sorry, I don't speak French. Apologies for the mispronunciation. But anyways, the French Colonial Office used these words to describe members of their fellow countrymen who they believe were giving France a bad name and lowering French prestige. And by doing so, were endangering the French mission to civilize Cambodia. In his introduction, author Gregor Muller explains his reason for wanting to focus on these bad Frenchmen, again, quote unquote. According to Muller, we often think of colonialism as the strong oppressing the weak. In actuality, however, things were a lot more complicated. In the case of Cambodia specifically, and in the history of colonialism generally, the actual colonizers who settled in the new territories were largely the social outcasts, business failures, and riffraff from their own country. They did not always identify with the interests of their own government, and they could at times side with the native population against their own government when it suited them. As Muller explains on page 6, quote, Caraman's story, and the stories of his fellow merchants in Phnom Penh, painfully illustrate that colonial rule in Cambodia was no well-oiled monolithic campaign, uniting military, bureaucratic, and economic aims in any preordained way. Instead, early colonization is shown to be a piecemeal affair, composed of scattered and haphazard efforts, often initiated by individuals and sometimes resting on unexpected alliances across the ethnic divide. As such, these narratives are, I believe, worth telling. The goal is not to trivialize the injustice of colonial rule, but if these stories remain untold, there is a risk, as Nicholas Thomas notes, that not simply a dimension of colonialism might be neglected, but that its coherence can be radically overstated. Now, to illustrate all of these points, Muller focuses in on the life of Thomas Caraman. Now, Thomas Caraman actually appeared a couple times in the book I had previously reviewed, The French Presence in Cochin China and Cambodia by Milton Osborne. And actually that's where Muller got the idea from. Muller also read The French Presence in Cochin China and Cambodia by Milton Osborne, and he was intrigued by the brief references in Osborne's book about Thomas Caraman to go to the National Archives in Phnom Penh and dig out all the papers relating to Thomas Caraman and then weave them together to make the narrative framework that makes up this book. It is interesting, though, how different the view of Thomas Caraman is in this book from the portrayal in Milton Osborne's book. Actually, Milton Osborne really doesn't portray him. We just get a few brief references, but from those brief references, from those brief references in Milton Osborne's book, Thomas Caraman appears to be a successful French merchant who was influential with the Cambodian royal court, but not always on good terms with his own government. But in the much fuller picture we get from Gregor Muller, Thomas Caraman appears to be a megalomaniac who was not perhaps altogether in touch with reality. Muller illustrates the huge gap between Caraman's grandiose visions of himself on one hand and his complete failure as a businessman on the other hand. The gap between Caraman's self-image and reality is so great that often he does not appear to be completely sane. Muller never attempts to diagnose him, or at least not fully diagnose him. He does suggest at times that Caraman may have been affected by a case of narcissism, which affected the way he viewed the world. Caraman had dreams of making it big in Cambodia, but had absolutely no business skills or cultural skills with which to do so. Like many of his fellow countrymen, he seems to simply have believed that he was guaranteed success in the colonies because of his white skin, which he thought would open every door and smooth out every difficulty. Instead, he spun from one magnificent failed business venture to another, but never really seemed to learn his lesson. After each failure, he blamed everyone but himself, and then picked himself up and tried another business venture. Although he developed a bad reputation with the colonial French government, surprisingly enough, despite Caraman's poor track record and complete lack of skills, his amazing confidence in himself appears to have been infectious. He apparently was a skilled enough talker that he was able to bamboozle various people into backing his ridiculous business plans every time. In fact, it was quite eye-opening for me to read this, because no matter how badly Caraman failed, he would always find new people to invest in his next business venture, and this appeared to be because he just had such self-confidence that other people just assumed he knew what he was doing. Which leads me to think of maybe there's a bit of a life lesson here. I mean, I am a person who is quite low on self-confidence, and I think that has in the past cost me job opportunities. Didn't get jobs I've interviewed for, didn't get job promotions that I interviewed for, because I would often kind of portray myself in denigrating terms or not project an air of self-confidence, because I thought, well, I'm not really that good at this. But the lesson from Thomas Caraman's life appears to be just project self-confidence and other people will completely buy into it. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, the other thing from Thomas Caraman's life is he just kept failing over and over and over again because he never seemed to learn what his weak points were or what his lack of skills were. So maybe it's a mixed message. I don't know. Anyways, back to the review. Gregor Muller reconstructs as much of Caraman's life as he can through his surviving letters and other archival documents. Then, he uses Caraman's life as a frame to explore other aspects of colonial French society in Cambodia. As a reader, it was not a framework that I was entirely happy about. Which brings me to the next section. Readability. So, is this a good book? Well, as always, that depends on what yardstick you want to use to judge it. As a work of scholarship, I think Gregor Muller has made a significant contribution to the field of history by rescuing Thomas Caraman's story from the molding old papers in the Phnom Penh archives. Apparently before this, nobody had ever put Thomas Caraman's life story together, and he was, I mean, as he pops up in Milton Osborne's book, he was an influential figure of some degree during the French colonial period. And, you know, who knows what would have happened in another 50 years if those papers would have disintegrated in the Phnom Penh archive or if they had still been available. It's good that Gregor Muller went in when he did and kind of rescued this story and reconstructed Thomas Caraman's life. So I think we can all be thankful for that. And when it comes to being informative, this book is very informative. I can't deny that I learned a lot about Cambodia and French colonial society from reading this book. But as somebody who reads history for a hobby, I primarily tend to judge these books on how enjoyable they are to read. And here, I regret to say, I must give this book low marks. It's not that Muller is a bad writer. His prose is very readable, and he displays some excellent talent for storytelling in some of the narrative passages. My big problem with the book is the editing. Take, for example, the opening paragraphs to chapter 6. So this is quoting chapter 6, page 157. William Hale had nothing against black people, as long as they stayed in their place. In the course of his career, he had learned to appreciate their work. For close to 20 years, he relied on black slave labor to sustain his cotton spinning mill in New Orleans. In antebellum Louisiana, where people were still bought and sold as property, Hale thrived. Once the Civil War had formally ended slavery in the southern states, and with many former slaves gone north, Hale decided to move to a place where labor remained cheap and abundant, and where his white skin counted for something. Perhaps this was the prime reason that he wound up in Saigon soon after the French conquest of the Mekong Delta. William Hale was the local representative of Jardine and Matheson, the largest Hong Kong merchant house in the Far East. He also dealt in insurance, shipping, and commodity trade. In 1874, the British consulate listed him as representing the leading British interests in the colony, including the legendary Lloyds of London. Hale was a busy man and needed no further responsibilities, but he kept a watchful eye on developments on the local cotton market and hoped that circumstances would one day permit him to return to his former trade. With American plantations struggling in the 1870s and the demand for quality cotton high on the world market, Saigon's traders were certain that cotton was Cochinchina's future. Unsuccessful forays into that area in previous years had not diminished the general optimism regarding the potential of local cotton. When one day, in May 1878, Caraman walked into Hale's office to tell him how he planned to revolutionize the Khmer cotton industry, Hale was ready to listen. End quote. So, I think hopefully you'll agree from those two paragraphs that the prose is actually quite well written and readable. My problem, however, is those are the two paragraphs that start off chapter 6. And after reading that, you would expect that William Hale would figure prominently in the rest of the chapter, right? It's a lot of build-up, giving his background, giving his personality, giving his interests. Or at the very least, you'd expect he'd figure prominently for the next few pages. But that's the last we hear of him. He pops up briefly on the next page, where there's one sentence written about him. That one sentence is, Hale was so impressed by Caraman's pitch that he loaned him several thousand piastres. So in other words, William Hale's only contribution to the story is to loan Thomas Caraman a lot of money, and then he's out of the story and we never hear from him again. But, I mean, it sounds like a minor complaint, and maybe it is. But this happened frequently throughout the book, where you're like, okay, we're going down this track now. We're going to hear about this guy. Oh, no, now we're going over here. Oh, now we're following this guy's story. It gave me a bit of a headache as I read this book. I felt like it was hard to tell kind of what tangent the author was going down. My other complaint about this book is that it focused much on analytical history at the expense of its story. Now, admittedly, this is a matter of personal preference. If you like scholarly books that are light on story but heavy on analysis, then obviously you won't mind this. But I prefer to read books that tell history as a story, and I was frustrated because the story kept getting interrupted by long analytical sections. Part of this is also perhaps disappointed expectations. I was hoping for a more readable popular history, and I felt like the title of this book and the cover seemed to promise more of a popular history story. But this book is actually not primarily a biography. Caraman's life does not make up the majority of this book. But instead, Muller will use Caraman's story as a jumping off point to go on at length about various digressions. I suspect maybe what happened is that there just wasn't enough surviving information on Thomas Caraman's life to make up a whole book. Or I don't know, maybe Gregor Muller wanted to write an analytical book all along. Who knows? But at any rate, I found the constant switching back and forth between narrative and analytical sections a bit jolting. Just when I felt like I was getting into Caraman's story, Muller would go off on some digression for 10 pages or so. When the book finally got around to returning to Caraman's story, I had largely forgotten what was going on with Caraman, and furthermore had stopped caring. To take a typical example, one of the more interesting events in Caraman's life is when he was commissioned by the Cambodian king, King Norodom, to procure certain items from France. Caraman manages to botch the job horribly, spending way more money than King Norodom was prepared to reimburse him for. When the king refused to pay for the items, when the king refused to pay for the items that Caraman had delivered, then an ad hoc tribunal had to be set up by the French colonial authorities to arbitrate the dispute. It's a fascinating little story, but right at the climactic moment of the showdown, right when they're going into arbitration, then the author Muller takes a 23-page digression to talk about the French legal system in Cambodia. In the course of these 23 pages, there are several digressions within the digression. We learn about the attitudes of the French to the Cambodian legal system, the history of the French judicial control, the question of whether Vietnamese nationals living in Cambodia should be subject to French law or Cambodian law. We even get yanked into various side stories, like a case about a Vietnamese woodcutter in French-controlled Cambodia, and the question of whether Indians living in Cambodia should have the same legal protection as European colonists. And then, finally, we get back to the story of Caraman and his legal dispute with King Norodom, at which point I had largely forgotten about that story, and had at any point stopped caring. We get a few more pages next about Caraman's various misadventures in Cambodia, but then the next chapter, which is chapter 5, entitled The Rules of Romance and Reproduction, 1877 to 1879, takes some passing remark that Caraman once made about his Cambodian mistress as an excuse to go on a 30-page digression about every aspect of French interaction with Cambodian women. In the course of this digression on colonial romance, Muller briefly returns to Caraman's story to talk about a fistfight between Caraman and his Siamese Mandarin neighbor that attracted much attention. But then, without concluding that story, without even bothering to say who won the fight, Muller then goes off on more digressions. And this is typical of the whole book. I found it frustrating myself. Also, at the end of each chapter or section, the author has a tendency to explicitly spell out the lessons that can be learned from each subject, which unfortunately makes the book sound a bit like a textbook. However, as always, take my opinion with a grain of salt, because quite often my opinion is not in lockstep with what other people think. And that's the case with this book. This book is at least when I was living in Cambodia, which was from 2011 to 2015. It was quite popular with the expatriate crowd who lived there, particularly people like me who tended to be interested in the history of the region. A lot of my friends I knew who had read it. It often got talked about during kind of those late night drinking sessions at bars. And everybody else loved this book except me. Even when I would try to explain all the reasons that I found it frustrating, they didn't agree with me. They would say, nope, it was a really interesting book. It was interesting. So, I'm out on the minority on this one. Certainly, whatever you do, don't not read this book because of me. If you're thinking whether or not to get it, don't take my opinion as a reason not to get this book. I seem to be the minority on this one. Okay, but before I wrap up, I'm just going to put in a couple random points here. Despite my frustrations with this book as a whole, there were several interesting tidbits to be gained along the way. In spite of all the book's flaws, there may be enough little interesting nuggets to justify reading it after all. For example, during the Cambodian uprising against the French in 1884 to 1887, there are some interesting, if rather horrifying, passages describing the torched earth policy the French commanders practiced against the Cambodian villagers. It's a reminder that the Americans were not the first Western power to commit atrocities in this country. Also, another reason that this book is so popular among the Cambodian expats is there are a lot of parallels between the Cambodian, the expatriate community in Cambodia now and the French expatriate community that was described in this book. It may or may not surprise you to learn that there are actually a lot of expatriates living in Phnom Penh nowadays. Much as there were a lot of expatriates living in Phnom Penh during Thomas Caraman's days. Now, obviously there was a 30-year period or so during all the civil wars and American bombing where nobody wanted to live in Phnom Penh. But that period is over now. there's a lot of expatriates who have made their lives in Phnom Penh. And when you're living in Phnom Penh and you're living this expatriate life, and you're seeing how they've got this little expatriate bubble that kind of separates them from local life, and then you read about the French expatriates, 150 years ago in Thomas Caraman's time, the parallels jump right out at you, which I think is why my friends enjoyed this book so much. And indeed, I did find that aspect of it fascinating myself. So there you go. That's my review, and hopefully I didn't ramble on for too long here. 25 minutes. Not bad.